Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth. The first case on our list is the case that quite literally changed how violent crime is investigated for the rest of human history. Two schoolgirls in the same English village, 3 years apart, an innocent man who had falsely confessed to one of the killings, and the very first conviction ever obtained in the world based on DNA fingerprinting evidence. Linda Rosemary Mann was a high school student in Narborough, Leicestershire, England. Dawn Ashworth was a high school student in the neighboring village of Enderby. Their cases would become permanently linked. On the 21st of November 1983, Linda set off from her home to visit a friend's house. She did not return that night. The next morning, a passerby found her on a deserted footpath that locals called the Black Pad. She had been attacked and ended. A semen sample was retrieved from the scene. None of the leads went anywhere. The case went cold. Almost 3 years later, on the 31st of July 1986, Dawn Ashworth left her home to visit a friend. She did not come back. 2 days after that, her body was discovered in a wooded area near a footpath called 10-Pound Lane. She had been harmed in the same way Linda had. Forensic examiners recovered another semen sample. How does a quiet, rural English village end up with two unsolved cases of harmed schoolgirls, with no clear suspect for either? The answer was that, by mid-1986, the police did believe they had a suspect. A young kitchen porter at a local hospital named Richard Buckland appeared to know an unusual amount about the location of Dawn's body. Brought in for questioning, Buckland confessed to harming Dawn, but he flatly denied any involvement in the earlier case of Linda Mann. To investigators who had spent 3 years working that first case, the partial confession felt close to a complete one. They expected to charge him with both. That is the moment the case became something else entirely. A scientist at the University of Leicester named Alec Jeffreys had, around 18 months earlier, made a discovery he had described as genetic fingerprinting. Police now turned to him with a new question. Could Jeffreys take the DNA from Buckland and the DNA from the two crime scenes and tell them whether their suspect was guilty? Jeffreys agreed. His result, when it came, broke the case in a way no one had expected. The two semen samples, from Linda's scene and from Dawn's, had come from the same man. Buckland's DNA was not a match to either. The kitchen porter had not been involved. His confession had been false. Buckland became the first person in history to be cleared of a serious crime by DNA evidence. The police now had a new problem. They knew one man was responsible for both cases, but had no idea who he was. So they did something that had also never been done before. They asked every adult man in the 3 villages, around 5,000 of them, to voluntarily provide a blood sample for DNA comparison. The screening turned up nothing. The break came in August 1987 in a Leicester pub. A bakery worker named Ian Kelly was overheard telling colleagues that he had been paid by another man, Colin Pitchfork, to give a sample on Pitchfork's behalf using a forged passport. One of the people at the table reported the conversation to police. On the 19th of September 1987, Colin Pitchfork was arrested. His DNA matched both crime scenes. On the 23rd of January 1988, Pitchfork was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 30 years. He was 27 at the time of the trial. The story of Pitchfork did not end with the sentencing. In September 2021, after 33 years inside, Pitchfork was released on parole. Within 2 months, in November 2021, he was recalled to prison after being seen approaching young women while out walking. The parole board granted him release again in 2023, but the decision was blocked by then Justice Secretary Alex Chalk. On the 30th of October 2025, the parole board ruled that Pitchfork would stay in prison, citing concerns about new previously unidentified risk in his behavior. While Linda and Dawn's case became the very first DNA conviction in human history, the next case waited 20 years for the same science to advance just enough to deliver an answer. Marion Crofts. The next case spent 20 years sealed inside a forensic evidence locker, waiting for the science of DNA itself to catch up. A teenager cycling to band practice in rural Hampshire, an army base just over a mile away. And a deliberate decision by investigators that would only pay off 2 decades after it was made. Marion Crofts was a high school student living in Fleet, Hampshire, England. She was a student at Wavell School in Farnborough. She played the clarinet. On the morning of the 6th of June, 1981, she was cycling alone from her home to band practice near the Basingstoke Canal. She never arrived. By that afternoon, her body had been found by a police dog handler in the undergrowth of a wooded area near Aldershot. Her bicycle had been hidden nearby. Her clarinet case had been thrown into the Basingstoke Canal and was later retrieved. The initial investigation involved more than 130 witness interviews. One of the men questioned was a lance corporal in the Army Catering Corps named Tony Jasinski. He was based at the nearby Aldershot Army Barracks. He was living in Army married quarters about a mile and a half from the scene with his pregnant wife. His alibi held at the time. He was not arrested. The case stalled. How does a child cycling to band practice on a public road a mile and a half from an army base end up the victim of a crime that goes unsolved for 2 decades? The answer was that the investigation in 1981 had reached the limit of what the forensic science of the time could do. The killer had left DNA on Marion's clothing, on her sock, and on her body. But in 1981, the technology to read that DNA simply did not exist. So the investigators did something that, decades later, looks remarkable. According to DNA Legal, they deliberately sealed the evidence and put it away. They were betting correctly that one day the science would advance enough to come back to it. They were right. In 1999, 18 years after Marion's death, scientists used a new technique called low copy number DNA profiling. The technique allowed investigators to extract a usable DNA profile from samples that contained only a few cells. They obtained a profile from the killer. They uploaded it to the United Kingdom's National DNA Database. For 2 more years, the database produced no match. The break, when it came not from the original investigation, but from a completely separate event. In April 2001, a man in Leicester was arrested by local police for assaulting his wife. Following standard procedure, his DNA was taken at the time of the arrest. His name was Tony Jasinski. By then, he had left the army. He was working as a security guard. He had been divorced from his first wife since 1984 and had remarried. When his sample was uploaded to the National DNA Database, it returned a hit. The match to the Crofts crime scene was, the prosecution later told the jury, 1 in a billion. Jasinski was arrested and charged in April 2001. He denied the charges. The trial was held at Winchester Crown Court in 2002. The defense challenged the DNA evidence and put forward alternative theories. After a 4-week trial, the jury deliberated for 3 hours before finding Jasinski guilty. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a concurrent 10-year term. In sentencing, Judge Michael Broderick told Jasinski he had committed a cruel and callous crime and that he had given the Crofts family 21 years of suffering as they thought of the final moments of Marion's life. In 2014, Jasinski appealed his life sentence on the technical argument that the DNA evidence was flawed. The Court of Appeal rejected his appeal. As of November 2025, per Grokopedia, Jasinski remains in prison. In June 2025, a retired detective publicly stated that Jasinski is the prime suspect in 2 other unsolved cases from the early 1980s, those of Wendy Brown and Lindsay Ward, while Marion's case ended with science catching up after 20 years. The next case is one of the most well-known cold cases in Alaska's history, and the killer was identified only after a stranger uploaded their own DNA to a public genealogy website. Jessica Baggin, The next case is one of the most well-known cold cases ever solved by genetic genealogy in the state of Alaska. A high school senior walking the short distance home from her own birthday party, a wrongful confession that led to an acquittal, and a man in Arkansas who took his own life 30 minutes after investigators left his front door. Jessica Baggin was a high school senior in Sitka, Alaska. The day before her disappearance, on the 3rd of May 1996, she had been celebrating her birthday at her sister's residence with a small gathering of family and friends. In the early morning hours of the 4th of May, she decided to walk home alone, a distance of about a mile. Her parents woke the next day to find that she had never made it back. Her father reported her missing to the Sitka Police Department. Her body was discovered on the 6th of May, hastily buried beneath the trunk of a large fallen tree in a wooded area behind what was then Sheldon Jackson College. Now we get to the part of the case that would haunt the Sitka Police Department for the next 24 years. 9 days after Jessica's body was discovered, a man contacted the Sitka Police Department and confessed to the crime. There was, however, a problem. None of the physical evidence collected from the scene matched him. He went to trial in early 1997 and was found not guilty on all charges. The man with the matching DNA was still out there. How does a young woman walking a single mile home from her own birthday party simply disappear in a town of fewer than 9,000 people, where everyone knows everyone? The answer was that, for the next 2 decades, more than 100 potential suspects were cleared through DNA comparisons. Sitka Police, the Alaska State Troopers, and a private investigator hired by the Baggin family all worked the case at different points. Each lead ended the same way. By the late 2010s, the trail had gone completely cold. The break came from a new field of forensic science. In September 2018, the Cold Case Investigation Unit at the Alaska State Troopers and the Sitka Police Department began discussing genetic genealogy. The Alaska State Crime Detection Laboratory determined that there was sufficient suspect DNA from the original investigation to generate a profile. They sent it to a Virginia firm called Parabon Nanolabs. In February 2019, the profile was uploaded to public genealogy databases. By the end of that year, 2 genetic genealogists had narrowed the suspect pool to one man. His name was Steve Branch. He was 66. He was living in Austin, Arkansas. He had grown up in Sitka. He had lived in Sitka at the time of Jessica's disappearance. And in March of 1996, only weeks before Jessica disappeared, the Sitka Police Department had investigated Branch for harming another teenager. He had been indicted in June and acquitted at trial in 1997. In May 2020, Sitka police obtained a discarded DNA sample from a relative of Branch. The kinship analysis confirmed Branch was most likely the source. On the 3rd of August 2020, Alaska Bureau of Investigation investigators traveled to Branch's home in Arkansas. They asked him directly about the case. He denied involvement. He refused to provide a sample. The investigators left the property to apply for a search warrant. 30 minutes after they left, Branch shot himself. After securing a search warrant, investigators collected Branch's DNA at his autopsy. On the 10th of August 2020, the Alaska State Crime Detection Laboratory confirmed his DNA matched the suspect DNA found on Jessica's clothing and at the scene. On the 11th of August 2020, the Alaska State Troopers announced the case as solved. While Branch would never face a jury of his peers, Jessica's case could finally be called solved. If you have made it this far and you enjoy content like this, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the cases coming up next include the oldest cold case ever solved in Sacramento County, and a killer who mailed a letter to the local newspaper 16 months after his crime. While Jessica's case closed with a suicide 30 minutes after a knock at the door, The next case spent 52 years sitting in a Sacramento evidence locker, becoming the oldest cold case ever solved in the entire history of Sacramento County. Nancy Benelak. The next case sat in a Sacramento County evidence locker for 52 years, and when it was finally solved, it became the oldest homicide cold case ever closed in the entire history of the county. A young court reporter engaged to a senior public defender, a balcony left open for a cat, and a neighbor who had been living in the same apartment complex the entire time. Nancy Benelak was 28 years old. She was a Sacramento court reporter. She was engaged to Ferris Salami, who at the time was the chief public defender of Sacramento County. She had been working on a high-profile case at the courthouse. The two had had dinner together on the night of the 25th of October, 1970. Salami left her apartment around 11:30 at night to return to his own home. The two were due to be married in just a few weeks. According to retired Sergeant Mickey Links of the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office, Nancy had a habit of leaving the sliding glass door to her second-story balcony slightly ajar so her cat could go outside. That detail, as innocent as it was, would become the defining feature of the case. How does a young woman, asleep in her own home in a quiet apartment complex, become the victim of a violent attack with no warning? The answer would take the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office 52 years to deliver. Sometime between 11:30 at night on the 25th and the early morning hours of the 26th of October 1970, an intruder climbed up the second-story balcony with tape on his fingers to avoid leaving prints and entered the apartment through the open slider. The next morning, when she did not arrive at work, a coworker called her son to check on her. The apartment manager opened the front door with a pass key. Nancy was found inside. The intruder had cut himself during the attack. A trail of blood led from the balcony down to the sidewalk below, around the apartment complex, and ended at the parking lot. Investigators believed he had cut himself and then driven away. For decades, the case sat. In 2004, a forensic DNA profile was developed from the blood drops left at the scene. The unknown male profile was uploaded to the combined DNA index system. The profile was run through California's familial search system 5 separate times between 2009 and 2021. Each search returned a negative result. The break came in 2021. The Sacramento County District Attorney's Office was awarded a prosecuting cold cases using DNA grant from the Federal Bureau of Justice Assistance. With the new funding, investigators uploaded the suspect's DNA profile to publicly accessible genealogical databases. 2 genealogists then spent 2 years building out an extended family tree. After overcoming significant challenges, the family tree finally produced a name. The suspect was a man named Richard John Davis. Davis had been 27 at the time of the crime. He had lived in the same apartment complex as Nancy. He had been her neighbor the entire time. Davis, however, was already deceased. Per forensics colleges, he had died in 1997 at age 54 of complications of alcoholism. His body had been cremated. There was no remaining direct DNA sample available. Investigators identified a family member of Davis who agreed to cooperate. A DNA sample from the relative was obtained and analyzed. The kinship analysis confirmed Davis as the source of the blood at the scene. On the 11th of August, 2022, more than 52 years after Nancy's death, Sacramento County Sheriff Under Sheriff Jim Barnes, retired homicide detective Mickey Links, District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert, and members of the Benelak family appeared at a joint press conference. They announced the case had been solved. Linda Cox, Nancy's sister, said in court that for 52 years she had thought she was going to die before they ever found out who did it. The case had taken her family's mother, who passed away years before the answer came. The Sacramento County District Attorney noted at the press conference that without genetic genealogy as a tool, they would not have been able to deliver an answer at all. While Nancy's case was solved by a piece of evidence sitting in a freezer for half a century, the next case was solved by the same forensic technique, but the breakthrough came from somewhere even less expected. A letter the killer himself had mailed to the local newspaper. Anna Jean Kane. The next case is one of the most unusual cold case solves ever recorded in Pennsylvania. A young mother of 3 left along a rural road in Berks County. A letter sent to the local newspaper a year and a half later by someone calling himself a concerned citizen, and a saliva-sealed envelope that, 3 decades later, would deliver the killer's identity in a single forensic test. Anna Jean Kane was a 26-year-old mother of 3. She had been living in Reading, Pennsylvania, but had moved to the Birdsboro area shortly before her death. On the afternoon of the 23rd of October, 1988, her body was found beside the Ontelaunee Trail Road in Perry Township in Berks County. She had been harmed, and her life ended. The last sighting of her alive had been around 1 in the morning that same day on Franklin and South 6th Streets in Reading. Investigators believed she had been ended elsewhere and her body transported to the wooded area where she was found. The ground beneath her was wet from earlier rain, but her clothing was not, suggesting the body had been placed there after the rain stopped. DNA evidence was collected from her clothing and preserved as evidence. There were no leads, no suspects, no people of interest. The trail went cold. How does a case with preserved DNA, in the era of an active and growing national database, sit unsolved for nearly 35 years? The answer was that the killer had never been arrested for a crime that would put his DNA into any criminal database. So the trail stayed cold until something happened that no investigator could have predicted. In February 1990, 16 months after Anna's death, the Reading Eagle newspaper had run a front-page story about the case, asking the public for any information. A few days later, an anonymous letter arrived at the newspaper, signed by a person calling himself a concerned citizen. The letter contained, as State Police Trooper Daniel Wummer would later put it, numerous intimate details about the homicide, details that had not been released to the public, details that only the killer could have known. Investigators kept the letter. They knew it was important. They could not, in 1990, do anything more with it than read it. The decades passed. The killer, whoever he was, kept living. The Pennsylvania State Police kept the letter and the original physical evidence in storage. In 2022, investigators turned to genetic genealogy. They first sent the saliva-sealed envelope of the 1990 letter to a laboratory for DNA testing. The DNA on the envelope matched the DNA on Anna's clothing. They had confirmed, for the first time, that whoever had mailed that letter was the same person who had ended Anna's life. The Pennsylvania State Police then sent the combined DNA profile to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia for genetic genealogy work. Parabon's analysis identified a possible suspect. His name was Scott Grimm. He was a native of Hamburg, Pennsylvania. He would have been 26 at the time of Anna's death. Scott Grimm, however, was already dead. He had passed of natural causes in 2018 at age 58. State investigators obtained a direct sample of Grimm's DNA. Per Pennsylvania State Police, the Pennsylvania State Police Lab confirmed that all 3 DNA samples, the original evidence from Anna's clothing, the envelope from the 1990 letter, and the direct sample from Scott Grimm were a match. They were all from the same contributor. On the 18th of August, 2022, Pennsylvania State Police and Berks County District Attorney John Adams announced the case as solved. Anna's daughter, Tamika Reyes, told CNN she was happy to finally put a face behind the man who had taken her mother from her, and upset that he would never face the consequences. District Attorney Adams said in court that while Grimm was deceased, the case had been solved. and the family had finally received some closure. Investigators are still trying to determine whether Anna and Grim had any prior connection. The full reason a man would mail a letter taunting investigators about a case 16 months after committing it has never been answered. While Anna's case ended with a letter that gave up its writer's identity 34 years too late. While Anna's case turned a piece of taunting mail into the killer's identity, the next case is one of the most striking modern cold case solves in Las Vegas history. And it was cracked not by police funding or a federal grant, but by a small group of volunteers who pay for DNA testing out of their own pockets. Melanie White. Melanie White was 27 years old. She was a young mother who had recently moved to Las Vegas from out of state with her boyfriend in the spring of 1994. By August of that year, her family had not been able to reach her for some time. On the 27th of August, 1994, two hikers walking near Gypsum Wash, off Lake Mead Boulevard, around 10 miles east of Las Vegas, came across the body of a woman. Per the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, it was obvious she had been dragged to where she was found. The Clark County coroner identified her the following day as Melanie White. Her cause of death was ruled a homicide. Police would later determine she had been dragged out of a vehicle, into the wash, and left there. How does a young mother, brand new to a city, with no enemies and no criminal record, end up in a desert wash 10 miles from Las Vegas? The answer was that, for years, no one could say. Investigators followed every lead they had at the time. None of them led anywhere. The case went cold and was transferred to the LVMPD Cold Case section. In May 2010, 16 years after the original investigation, Cold Case detectives reviewed the file and submitted additional items recovered from the scene for DNA testing. The lab was able to develop a male DNA profile from the recovered evidence. The profile was uploaded to the National CODIS database. It returned no match. The man had never been arrested for anything that would have put his DNA into the system. The trail went cold again. What changed 11 years later was a man named Justin Wu. Wu was a Las Vegas-based entrepreneur who, in 2020, had founded a small nonprofit organization called the Vegas Justice League. The nonprofit had a single mission. It would raise donations from the community and use that money to pay for forensic genetic genealogy testing on cold cases that local police could not afford to send to outside labs. According to CNN, the cost of a single case at the right lab was around $7,500. For most departments, that was not within the budget. For a small group of donors, it was within reach. In 2021, the Vegas Justice League stepped in to fund the Melanie White case. LVMPD cold case detectives sent the original DNA profile to a Texas-based laboratory called Othram, which specialized in forensic-grade genome sequencing. Othram began the process of building a family tree from the suspect's DNA, working through public genealogy databases until they could narrow the suspect to a single person. The wait, in this case, was nearly 3 years. Then, on the 26th of August, 2024, almost exactly 30 years to the day Melanie's body had been found, Othram contacted the LVMPD with a name. The suspect was Arthur Joseph Lavery. He had attended a local high school. He had grown up in the Las Vegas area. He had been 38 at the time of the crime. His only previous arrest, according to LVMPD Homicide Lieutenant Jason Johansson, had been for battery in Las Vegas, which was why he had never appeared in any DNA database. Lavery, however, was already deceased. He had moved from Las Vegas to California in the mid-2000s. He had died in February 2021 of heart disease and complications from COVID-19. On the 22nd of October 2024, the LVMPD held a press conference to announce the case as solved. Melanie's two younger brothers, Walter and Jason White, were present. They thanked the Vegas Justice League directly for funding the test. Lieutenant Johansson said the Vegas Justice League's support had directly led to the closure of 9 cold cases that would never have been solved without their assistance. While Melanie's case was closed by a small group of volunteers funding a single test, the next case set a different kind of record. It was the first time in Canadian legal history that the same forensic technique was tested in a courtroom. Aaron Gilmore and Susan Tice. The next case is the case that brought genetic genealogy into a Canadian courtroom for the first time in history. 2 women in Toronto, killed 4 months apart in 1983, in their own homes by the same stranger. A DNA link that connected the 2 cases in 2000, and a Cree man living in a remote town in northern Ontario who had no idea, almost 40 years later, that science was finally about to come for him. Susan Tice was 45 years old. She was a family therapist and a mother of 4. She had recently moved to Toronto from Calgary the month before her death. Aaron Gilmore was 22 years old. She was an aspiring fashion designer working as a store manager in the Yorkville neighborhood of Toronto. She was the daughter of David Gilmore, the Canadian mining tycoon who had co-founded Barrick Gold. The 2 women did not know each other. On the 17th of August, 1983, Susan was found in her home on Gray Street in the Bickford Park neighborhood by a relative. She had been harmed, and her life ended in her own bed. There were extensive defensive injuries on her body. She had fought hard. 4 months later, on the 20th of December 1983, Aaron was found in her Hazelton Avenue apartment by a family friend. He was the son of Peter Monk, the co-founder of Barrick Gold, the same company Aaron's father had founded with him. Aaron had been bound, her hands tied. She had been harmed in the same way Susan had. How does the same stranger walk into 2 homes in the same city, 4 months apart, and harm 2 women who never met? The answer was that, in 1983, no one knew the cases were connected. Each was investigated separately. Aaron's case was widely publicized due to her family's prominence in Canadian business. Both went cold within a year. In 2000, the Toronto Police Service ran the original DNA evidence from both cases through new comparative testing. The results showed, for the first time, that the same man had been at both scenes. Per Oxygen, the 2 cases had been linked by a single piece of DNA. They still had no name. The next 18 years passed without a break. Then, in 2018, the Golden State Killer case in California demonstrated something remarkable. Investigators in that case had used a public genealogy database, GED match, to find distant relatives of the killer and reverse engineer his identity. Toronto police took notice. The Toronto Cold Case section partnered with Othram Labs in Texas. By 2021, the work had narrowed the suspect to a single Cree family of 5 brothers from a remote community in northern Ontario. Investigators eliminated 4 of the 5 brothers through additional testing. That left exactly 1 suspect. His name was Joseph George Sutherland. On the 24th of November, 2022, Toronto police investigators traveled to the town of Moosonee, Ontario, to serve Sutherland with a DNA warrant. Sutherland complied. He was 61. The day after he was tested, before the lab results were even back, Sutherland confessed to a longtime friend named Coda that he had done some things he was not proud of. Per Oxygen's reporting, Sutherland told his friend exactly what had happened in 1983. The DNA confirmed the confession. On the 5th of October 2023, he pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder. On the 22nd of March 2024, Justice Maureen Forrestel sentenced him to life in prison with no chance of parole for 21 years, the upper end of the available range. Sutherland will not be eligible for parole until 2043. The case was the first conviction in Canadian legal history in which investigative genetic genealogy evidence was tested in court. If you have made it this far and you enjoy content like this, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the cases coming up next include a 45-year-old California cold case finally solved by a genealogy match, and a wrongful conviction overturned by the same science that caught the actual killer. While Susan and Aaron's case set the legal precedent for genetic genealogy in Canada, the next case is one of the most heartbreaking on the entire list. A young child taken from a Newport Beach neighborhood in 1973. Linda O'Keefe. The next case is one of the most heartbreaking entries on the entire list. A young child taken from a Newport Beach neighborhood in 1973. A forensic preserved evidence sample that sat in a freezer for 45 years. And a social media campaign that put her face back into the world 4.5 decades after her death. Linda O'Keefe was a young child living in the Corona del Mar neighborhood of Newport Beach, California. She was a Girl Scout. She liked to paint. She was a Nancy Drew fan. On the afternoon of the 6th of July, 1973, she was walking home from summer school at Lincoln Intermediate. She was last seen by witnesses near Marguerite and Inlet Drive in Corona del Mar, talking to a stranger in a turquoise van. She did not arrive home that afternoon. The next morning, her body was found in a ditch in the Back Bay Nature Trail in Newport Beach by an architect named Ron Yo and his son. How does a young child walking home from school in broad daylight in a quiet residential neighborhood vanish into the back of a stranger's van? The answer was that, for the next 45 years, no one could deliver. The original investigators handled the case as carefully as the science of 1973 would allow. According to CBS News, a forward-thinking criminalist named Jim White preserved evidence from the scene in a screw cap vial and put it in a freezer. He could not have known what would come next. He simply preserved what had been collected as well as he could, and trusted that the science would one day be ready. The science, when it finally arrived, took decades. By 2001, a DNA profile from the preserved evidence had been entered into the CODIS National Database. It returned no match. Linda's killer had never been arrested for anything that would have put him in the system. The case went cold again. By 2018, when the Newport Beach Police Department took yet another fresh look, the case had been worked by what one chief described as generations of investigators. In July 2018, on the 45th anniversary of Linda's death, the Newport Beach Police Department launched something completely new. They ran a social media campaign on Twitter called Linda's Story. They wrote out the entire last day of Linda's life, hour by hour, in real time, from her own perspective. The campaign reached millions of people. They paired the campaign with a phenotype prediction composite from Parabon Nanolabs, which used the DNA profile to estimate what the killer might look like. The break came in January 2019. According to Orange County District Attorney Todd Spitzer, an upload to the Family Tree DNA public database returned a hit. The hit pointed to a man named James Allen Neal. He was 72. He was living in Colorado Springs. He had lived in Southern California in the 1970s, before moving to Florida and then to Colorado. At the time of the crime, he had been using a different name, James Allen George Layton. Investigators put Neal under surveillance and obtained a sample of his DNA. The sample matched the evidence Jim White had preserved 46 years earlier. Neal was arrested in Colorado Springs on the 19th of February, 2019. He was charged with murder with special circumstances and other related charges. He also faced separate charges in Riverside County, California, for unrelated crimes against young people committed in the 1990s and early 2000s. Linda's older sister, Cindy Borgeson, in interviews after the arrest, said that finding out there was a face and a name brought additional closure. She also said she had been praying for him Neil never went to trial. On the 27th of May, 2020, while still in custody awaiting trial, Neil died at an Orange County hospital. He was 73. The cause was an undisclosed illness, not COVID-19. As District Attorney Spitzer said in court, the question had never been if they would find Linda's killer, only when. While Linda's case ended with the killer dying before trial, the next case is one of the most consequential in the modern history of forensic DNA, because it both convicted the actual killer and freed an innocent man who had spent 20 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. Angie Dodge. The next case is one of the most consequential in the modern history of forensic DNA. A young woman ended her life in Idaho. An innocent man wrongly convicted who served 20 years in prison. A mother who switched sides and demanded the truth. And the world's first exoneration ever delivered by genetic genealogy. Angie Dodge was 18 years old. On the morning of the 13th of June, 1996, she was found in her Idaho Falls apartment after she had failed to show up for work. According to the Innocence Project, she had been harmed and her life ended. The Idaho Falls Police Department investigated. The summer and fall of 1996 came and went without an arrest. In early 1997, a man from Idaho Falls named Benjamin Hobbs was arrested in Nevada on an unrelated charge. Idaho Falls police interviewed Hobbs, then began questioning his friends, looking for a way to build a case against him. One of those friends was a 20-year-old man named Christopher Tapp. Tapp was the wrong man. The DNA at Angie's scene did not match him. He had nothing to do with the crime. But over more than 28 hours of recorded interrogation across 23 days, after multiple polygraph tests and the repeated threat of the death penalty, Tapp confessed. He named 2 of his friends as accomplices. How does a man sit in an interrogation room for 28 hours and confess to a crime he had nothing to do with? The answer, according to one of the country's leading false confession experts, Steve Drizin of Northwestern Law School, would later be one of the worst examples of police contamination he had ever seen in 15 years of reviewing such cases. Detectives had fed Tapp the facts. They had pointed at crime scene photos. They had told him what answers they wanted. Per Dateline, Tapp had simply repeated back what they wanted to hear. A jury convicted Tapp in May 1998. He was sentenced to 30 years to life. His DNA had never matched the scene. The prosecution had argued, against all evidence, that he must have been there. The break in the case came not from the police, but from Carol Dodge, Angie's mother. Carol had originally been the loudest voice demanding the death penalty for Tapp. But over the years, the DNA mismatch began to bother her. She watched the recorded interrogation tapes. She told Dateline that there were times she had wanted to put her fist through the screen. She switched sides and became one of Tapp's most vocal advocates. In 2017, after 20 years inside, part of Tapp's conviction was vacated and his murder sentence reduced to time served. The murder conviction itself, however, still stood. Carol kept pushing. Carol personally recruited the genetic genealogist C.C. Moore at Parabon Nanolabs. Moore worked with what was, by genealogy standards, an incomplete sample. Per the Marshall Project, the sample contained only 61% of the information she would normally need. At Carol's urging, Moore tried it anyway. After eliminating 6 men in a candidate lineage, Moore identified a 7th, Brian Lee Drips Sr. Drips had lived directly across the street from Angie in 1996. He had been one of the original neighbors canvassed by police 5 days after the crime, and then dismissed. Idaho Falls police surveilled Drips and recovered a discarded cigarette butt from his car. The cigarette matched the crime scene DNA. On the 15th of May 2019, Brian Drips was arrested. He confessed. He told detectives he had been heavily impaired by substances that night, that he had acted alone, and that he did not know Christopher Tapp, On the 17th of July, 2019, Judge Alan Stevens vacated Tapp's remaining murder conviction. Per the Innocence Project, it was the world's first exoneration ever delivered by investigative genetic genealogy. Dripps pleaded guilty in February 2021 and was sentenced to life with parole eligibility after 20 years. In June 2022, the city of Idaho Falls settled with Tapp for $11.7 million. Tapp died in October 2023 after an altercation in a Las Vegas hotel room. While Angie's case freed an innocent man and convicted the actual killer, the final case on our list spent 47 years sitting in an evidence locker, was solved through a reverse paternity test, and led to a man who had been freed from a previous murder charge by reason of insanity, and who had been ended in a shootout with police 6 years after he killed. Pamela Milam. The final case on our list spent 47 years, 7 months, and 20 days, by the family's own count, sitting unsolved. A college sophomore at Indiana State University, a sorority event she left and never returned to, a body found in the trunk of her own car, and a killer who had been freed from a previous murder charge by reason of insanity and ended in a shootout with police only 6 years after he had taken her life. Pamela Milam was 19 years old. She was a sophomore at Indiana State University in Terre Haute, Indiana. She was a commuter student. She was a member of the Sigma Kappa sorority. She had been planning to spend the weekend on campus to attend sorority events. On the night of the 15th of September 1972, Pamela left her sorority sisters with a brief promise to be back in a few minutes. She had, she told them, gone to move her car closer to the dormitory she would be staying in. She did not return. She did not arrive at her library shift the following morning. Her father and her sister drove to the campus the next day to look for her. They found her car. They found her in the trunk, bound and gagged. An autopsy determined she had ended her life by strangulation. According to true crime pages, she had been harmed before her life ended. How does a college sophomore disappear from a campus full of people in the middle of a sorority weekend with no witnesses and no clear suspect? The answer was that for the next 47 years, no one would deliver one. The original investigators preserved physical evidence from the scene, including a sample on Pamela's blouse. For nearly 30 years, the case stayed cold. In 2001, Indiana State Police reopened the file and ran new DNA testing. Their original suspect, a campus serial offender named Robert Wayne Austin, was eliminated when the profile did not match his. In 2008, a Terre Haute police officer named Sean Keene took over. He had been born 2 years after Pamela's death. He inherited a case file that included 56 named possible suspects, none of whom had ever matched. By 2018, the original sample preserved at the scene was nearly gone. Per NBC News, there was only a shred left. He had to weigh whether to use what remained on a new technique called genetic genealogy. Knowing that if it failed, there would be nothing left, he sent the remaining sample to Parabon Nanolabs. The genealogy work narrowed the suspect to a single member of one family. His name was Jeffrey Lynn Hand. He had been 23 at the time of the crime. He had not been a student at Indiana State. He had worked as a delivery driver for a record company based in Illinois. Hand was already deceased. To prove the genealogy match, Keene used what is called a reverse paternity test. He tracked down Hand's widow and his 2 adult sons. They voluntarily provided DNA. The Indiana State Crime Lab then ran the comparison against the recovered DNA from the crime scene. The result came back at a 99.999% probability of paternity. Now we get to the part of the case that turned the resolution into something larger. Hand had not had a clean record between Pamela's death and his own. In June 1973, 9 months after Pamela's death, Hand had picked up a hitchhiking couple along an Indiana interstate. He had driven them to a rural farmhouse, harmed them, and ended the husband's life. The wife escaped and alerted state police. At the resulting trial, Hand was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Through a procedural error, he was released in 1976. In January 1978, in a Kokomo, Indiana shopping center parking lot, Hand attempted to abduct another woman at gunpoint. A clerk called 911. 2 officers pursued. Hand crashed, fled on foot, and shot one of them twice. The other officer returned fire. Hand was ended at the scene. Inside his car, investigators found rope, masking tape, and newspaper clippings of recently engaged couples. On the 6th of May 2019, Police Chief Sean Keane announced the case as solved. Pamela's sister, Charlene Sanford, said in court that many of them, as they had got older, had thought they would die before they ever learned who had taken their sister. Keane has urged law enforcement agencies across the Midwest to look at their cold cases for matches against Hand's DNA. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.